Hello, can you hear me?
Melanie, welcome to Charlotte Dune's Lagoon. I'm so happy to have you here. Why don't you introduce yourself, give my listeners and readers a little bit of detail on your background, who you are, where you are now, and talk about your recent time abroad.
All right, great. Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So my name is Melanie Duhon, and I'm an American, born and bred, but recently just returned from my second stint living in Beijing, China. My husband works for a Chinese company, which has taken us there twice. Once from 2011 to 2014. And this latest time we left in August of 2019 and just recently returned. So we got to have the whole COVID experience in China, which was, from what I can tell, very different than it was here back in the United States. So basically my background is in biology, but I've been recently teaching English as a second language. And doing other volunteer experiences. But when I'm in China, I'm basically just enjoying the culture and the people and having a really good time meeting people from all over the world. So I'm what's called a trailing spouse.
I love it. I was like, being a trailing spouse is either the best or the worst thing in the world. Like, I think I would actually love it because when you're working abroad, I worked abroad as well for a decade. And when you're working abroad, you don't get to enjoy the country as much as you think you're going to get to enjoy it because you're constantly working. But the trailing spouses, I was always very envious of them because they knew all the markets. They got to go to all the places for lunch, and I was in my office, just in my office. So how has that? I want to definitely talk about what the pandemic was like in China, but also how is it for you being a trailing spouse, and like the pros and the cons?
Well, I mean, the major con is you're not working, right? And for somebody who has been working most of her life, that's a bit of an adjustment. But I guess, like you said, it sort of depends upon where you are a trailing spouse, I think. And because it is difficult to get a work permit in China, almost all the other spouses who were there were also trailing. So we had a fairly decent population of expat, mostly women, some husbands, but mostly wives, who also had no job and were interesting people from all over the world. And we did so many wonderful things together. We traveled together. We played mahjong a couple times a week. We had a history lecture club with a local historian. So I found it like I had literally hundreds of friends from all over the world that I could hang out with. So being a trailing spouse for me, even without working, was really pretty awesome. And I mean, and COVID definitely affected that. But we were stuck in China that we couldn't leave very easily, which kind of just drew us sort of together, I think. Whereas like in other places, it isolated people because of the way COVID China dealt with COVID. They shut the country down, so we didn't have COVID. We couldn't leave, but there was no COVID. So we only had each other. And I mean, I made some really, really good friends. I think at this time as a trailing spouse, just really amazing women, with amazing backgrounds from all over the world. So I'm very pro trailing spouse in China, at least. I know it can be different in different expat experiences, but for me, it was pretty amazing.
I have so many questions. First off, like maybe describe a bit like what it actually look like for you guys. Like what kind of housing do people have there? How close were your friends? When you say there was no COVID, was it like just no, like everything completely normal? Because I think Americans have this impression that like China was all locked down and everyone was in condos with masks on.
So like most things with American media, you guys heard the great fun stories that were the most exciting to hear, and that all that did happen, but those were blips in time that most Americans have sort of focused on. and mostly Shanghai. When you're talking about the lockdowns that you heard about, that was Shanghai, and Wuhan, of course, when it first broke out. But that never really happened in Beijing. So we never got locked down like that. I mean, we were tested frequently, but generally, everybody who entered China had to quarantine. So they basically managed, for the most part, especially in Beijing, because Beijing was particularly strict because it's the capital. We had, for those 3 years, pretty much no COVID until we all got COVID, which we all did within the period of about a month. Last December, almost everybody I knew got COVID. It was when they finally decided, okay, we're done with this, we're just letting it in, it just whooshed right through. But before that, we really didn't have very many cases. If 1 or 2 came in, then they would lock down where they found those cases. But you're talking about, one apartment complex out of a city of 22 million people. So my apartment complex never got locked down. One of the buildings did for a week because there was a case there later, like in 2000, it was 2023, it's still 2023. No, 22. But for the most part, in Beijing, we didn't have that kind of oppression that you guys have heard about. There was always the threat of it, because if there was a case in your compound or a friend's compound that you had visited or anything like that, you could get locked down and you would spend 2 weeks in your apartment. But we never had to do that. That being said, we did come back to the US twice during that time period, and getting back in was difficult. We had to do the 2 weeks quarantine. The first time was 2 weeks plus 1 week in Shanghai. And then the second time was just 10 days. But that is in one hotel room, can't leave. That's not fun. But I mean, that's how they get COVID out. I get it. I'm not a proponent of the way that China dealt with COVID. But I'm also not a proponent of the way the US dealt with COVID. I understand that there's not really, with a virus, not a lot of happy medium in between the two, because it's a virus and they're fairly infectious. But I see both sides. I see the freedom that the US had, and I see the lack of freedom that we had. But we had no COVID, so. But you asked about how we are living. So we're living and then it's sort of the downtown area. Beijing is enormous. Most of my friends lived within, I'm going to say like a 10-mile radius of each other on the eastern side of Beijing. Just expats have a tendency to gravitate there. There were certain apartment complexes that people lived in that were aimed a little bit at expats because they had things like ovens, which most Chinese apartments don't have, and are just laid out a little differently, maybe some wood floors instead of, they like stone floors kind of thing. So a lot of us lived somewhat together. I mean, my compound was far from being entirely foreign, but it had a lot more foreigners than most compounds. And it was like, we had 5 buildings. Mine was 35 floors tall. I was on the 21st floor. It's a sweet deal because my company paid for it. Had a beautiful view of downtown Beijing and the big park that we live just on the south edge of Chaoyang Park, which is kind of like Central Park, only tacky. And just a beautiful, gorgeous apartment. It was nice. But I also had friends that lived out in the suburbs. There were homes that people had, especially people who had younger children, had a tendency to live out in the burbs. There was that option as well. But most of my friends lived downtown and were, within a couple miles of me.
To have a yard, I guess, would be to go to the suburbs.
Yeah. If you wanted your own yard, you wanted to be close. Most of the good international schools are out in the suburbs as well. So when my son was with us, he was there for the first 2 years. He had to take the bus out half an hour to school. So, which would have been longer commute if it hadn't been for COVID. There wasn't nearly as much traffic during COVID. So that's another reason people live out there. But our complex, we lived there both times. So we lived there in 2011 and 2014 as well. And like we had an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old at that point. But we had a big yard and shared area with playground and swings and trampolines and all that stuff. So, and the kids loved it. So it worked too. It's just kind of the style of living that you're looking for.
I'm curious if the Chinese apartments have some kind of oven alternative, or it's just like not popular enough to cook in an oven.
Yeah, they just don't bake things in general. If they want to, they're getting into it. It's getting kind of like there's places where you can go and pay. You know how we paint a pot, or you sip and chill and paint a painting. There's places you go in China and you bake because they have ovens. So you get together with your girlfriends for a party and you go bake your own birthday cake kind of thing. They will sometimes have toaster ovens, but most apartments don't. They cook everything fairly fresh, and they buy their baked goods. So
I'm fascinated. What is it like to live in a city of 22 million people? And if you could choose to go and live like anywhere, would you choose to live in China?
okay, first questions first. What's it like to live in a city of 22 million people? If you don't go out at rush hour, it's fine. um, if during when with non-COVID times, because this time is different, but the first time we lived there, like if you wanted to get on a bus at 8:30, 9 o'clock, good luck. And I mean, we didn't have a car. I used all public transportation because their public transportation is incredible. Buses, subways, shared bikes, anything you want available. Uber is really cheap. It's called Didi. Very easy. But yeah, I mean, it can get really crowded, and the subways and the buses, but in general, it didn't bug me too much. I like the city life. I mean, the first time we moved there, I'm always been living in the suburbs most of my life, so it was a little shock, but I absolutely loved it. I loved being able to hop downstairs to the little store to get my groceries and go to the wet markets and get fruits and vegetables and walk over to my friends or walk through the park. Or I just really like it. And park life in China is fabulous. The older generation there spends a lot of their time in parks, dancing, all their fun little dancing, doing Tai Chi, playing badminton. The old men walk their birds. And I mean, there's just a lot of
their birds.
They walk their birds. Yes.
Please explain.
So they keep the older generation, they keep songbirds. And they will go to the park and visit their friends, like same time every day. And they take their little birds in their little bird cages and they swing them. I don't know why I don't know if the birds like that. I don't know. And then they'll meet in one place and hang up their birds in the bird cages, all in the trees, and then just, chat like old people who do when they're retired. There are all kinds of fun things like that. The tradition of the older generation there is just really, the community feel of it, it's just amazing. I wish we had that in this country, because it would be fun to grow old that way. It's a much different experience in aging. But your second question, would I go back to China again? Would that be to where I chose? No, I'm done. I love China. It was fabulous. I am so glad that I had lived there. If we had a really good business opportunity, of course, we would go back again, and I would love it. I would be fine. But I would really like to go somewhere else. And Europe would be fabulous, but I don't see that in our future, unless we've managed to retire and, I don't know, teach English somewhere. I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Where does Beijing remind you of anywhere else? Is it comparable to anywhere else that you've been?
Oh. Wow. I mean, it somewhat is to nothing in America. Absolutely nothing in America. Maybe a little bit Tokyo, only Tokyo is a little less, how is the word to describe it? There's more rules and etiquette in Japan. China's a little bit sort of looser, a little dirtier. Which I actually kind of like. No, I mean, a lot of Chinese cities, I could compare Beijing to a lot of other Chinese cities, but outside of that, it's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I was curious. I have been to Tokyo, so I was actually curious if it reminded you. I was going to ask, like, is it super clean like Tokyo, where the subway is like you'd eat off the floor of the subway? Tokyo, or maybe not off the floor, but the bathrooms are like a 5-star hotel in the subway of Tokyo. It's crazy.
No. Beijing is not like that. It's much better than it was it's gotten a lot better in the last 10 years. In fact, so we were gone 5 years in between. So we left in 2014 and we got back in 2019. And in those 5 years, it got a lot cleaner. It got a lot cleaner. Like I would have never used the public bathrooms in 2014. I mean, you could smell them as you were walking by. You go, oh my gosh, there must be a bathroom coming. And then when we got back in 2019, they were all very, very clean. And like, I'd use them, no problem. I mean, they're all squatty potties, but I don't have a problem with that. So yeah, it's gotten a lot better. They're definitely cleaning a lot of things up. And then it's funny because that has pluses and minuses, because we like things to be clean and we like things to be efficient, but they're also getting rid of a lot of fun cultural stuff in the process of doing that. Beijing is known for its hutongs areas, which is hutong literally means alley, and I think they were built, I'm going to get this wrong and my historian friend is going to get mad at me, but I think they were built by the Mongols, and they're basically courtyard homes with narrow alleys between them, and they're just these squares of courtyard houses where you would enter, and then there would be open space, and then like building, and then you go through that and there'd be another building, and they sort of sectioned off it. It was the way they lived. It's called a Yuan, which is a 4 courtyard garden or something like that. And it was all kind of sectioned off, and they were built out of stone, 1 story, slate, those nice slate roofs, with the pitched on it, and Asian accents and things like that. There's a lot of gorgeous architecture and history in these. And they used to be where fairly wealthy people lived, some of them, but over the centuries, really, they've gotten subdivided, and so one family owned them and 2 sons split it, and then they split it with their 2 sons and all of this, and now they're each one has like 20 people in it, which is kind of ridiculous. And some people were operating stores out of the front windows, so you could like climb up to the window and they'd sell you a soda or something like that. And the walls of the front on the actual alleyway would have all these signs for restaurants or whatever was inside, but people were also living in there. And you'd walk into the courtyards and there'd be trash, just one man's trash is another man's treasure, old bikes, whatever, piled up. And then they've been getting rid of a lot of that. Walling up the fronts, they call it the brickening is what expats call it, because they just sort of bricked up the whole front so people couldn't run their businesses, and took a little bit of the charm out of it. Because when you look at old pictures of Beijing or newer pictures of Beijing anyway, they love these hutongs with their red lanterns and their gray stones, and they're just it's a lovely part of town to bike through and to walk through, and people live there. They're communities that people have lived in for generations, and they're bricking them up a little bit, tossing people out, tearing them down, and moving the people out to not fancy, but nice new apartment complexes, but far out of town, and breaking up the communities. And it's a bit of a, it's a thing, right? It's a sometimes the people want to go and they're happy to have their nice new apartment, but sometimes they're not, and they miss their community. And but yeah, it's an issue, but there's still a lot of those available just to wander through in Beijing, and it is a very fun part of Beijing.
Why do you think they're doing the brickening?
I think because too many people are living in there, too many businesses that were unregulated, and that's a tourist area, and they want it to be nicer. I mean, the area was never, these places don't have their own bathrooms, so they have community bathrooms that are down the way. So too much stress on those bathrooms. It was like people trying to live in an apartment complex that only had 1 floor and just stuffing more and more people in. So it is, for everybody's health and safety, better that not that many people live in there. But at the same time, it's sort of this cultural Beijing experience, these hutongs. So it's take it, and time you take something away, you gain something else, I guess.
I love that you're doing a historical study group, historian study group. were you learning specifically about like the history of Beijing or Chinese culture in general, or?
It was the history of modern China, which started in this particular class back in like the 1600s, so not that modern. And it was actually, so when COVID happened, all the international students got kicked out, right? The student visas were revoked and everybody got sent home. So there was one particular historian who had already been doing, he's American, had been doing walks and talks around on like weekends and stuff, who pretty much lost his day job because there were no students for him to teach at the university. So he actually approached me because I had this group of women that was very active in doing a lot of things, and asked if we wanted to do this lecture series. And it was supposed to only be six or seven lectures in the beginning. And we just, when it finished, we just loved it so much. It was just like it was a group of about 15 women, and we'd meet every other week in one of our homes and basically just learn about some aspect of Chinese history. And this particular guy, he was really good about, because he's married to a Chinese woman, he speaks fluent Chinese, so he kind of is a really good way to see sort of both sides a little bit more than, because I don't speak Chinese. I tried many hours. It is exceptionally difficult, and I have given up multiple times. So anytime I can talk to somebody who does speak Chinese, who has a better grasp of some of the stuff going on around me, it's a really good experience for me. So he was great, and he'd lecture us for a little while, but we'd ask questions and he gave us readings. And most of us went to university and we're very excited to have a little bit of intellectual engagement, since most of us weren't working, and we do a lot of lunches and kinds of things, and that can get a little boring. So this was a fun way to engage on a different level.
That sounds amazing. I know, like I was going to ask you how the language barrier is in China or in Beijing, and because it blew my mind. I remember I had studied French in the FSI system, and I think I got to level 2 in maybe 4 weeks doing the 9 to 5. And then I heard that to get to level 2 in Chinese, it takes 2 years. And I was like, what? How can it be 4 weeks for French and 2 years for the same? And level 2 isn't good. Level 2 is like,
yeah,
people are looking, it's not a great level to be at. It's just like you're just beginning your language journey. And I'm like, that alone would make me not want to learn Chinese, for people to fully realize how hard it is. So yeah, what was like your language learning approach, and how was the language barrier in general, like living in China as an American?
So I guess as an American, it was fine because, well, as a white American, it was fine because nobody expected me to speak the language. So in fact, I got into a situation sort of towards the end where I spoke enough of the language that I actually stopped speaking it because people thought I spoke it. But my issue was always that I didn't understand anything that was told to me. So I can actually usually in Chinese express most of the things I want, need, whatever, all that. But I have a hard time understanding when people speak back to me. And I fault the Chinese language learning system for this because there's not enough listening. As an ESL teacher, I understand the problem here. They want you to learn the words, they want you to learn the grammar, but there's not enough talking and listening, at least not in my experience. I mean, I've taken so many different Chinese classes at so much time, and I finally gave up when COVID happened because the only way I could do it was online one-on-one. And to me, language learning is best done in a group of people where you can listen to other people, hear their mistakes, learn from their mistakes as well as your own. And when COVID happened, that was not going to happen anymore. So I did the online classes to the point where she was pushing me to level 3. So I understand what you mean with level 2. Like I actually sort of completed level 3, but if anybody talked to me, I just was like, So I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to start level 4. But the great thing about China is everybody has a phone. Everybody uses their phone for everything. Your money, your ID, everything is on this phone. Everything is through WeChat. And there's translations apps, and everybody has a translation app. Not a ton of people speak English, but everybody understands that I speak English, so they all try. And again, because I look like the way I look, they don't expect me to speak Chinese. Now, if I were a Chinese American who came, and I had a lot of friends who had this problem, you know, like, okay, so here's the situation. I've got my kid, my 8-year-old little boy, and he's adorable. He's blonde, and Chinese people, oh, he's so cute, he's so blonde, taking pictures with my kid. And then one of my good friends is Chinese American, and she's got her 2 kids, same age. My kid says ni hao, and all the Chinese people, oh, look, this little white kid, he speaks Chinese. The other kids, you know, why don't your kids speak Chinese? It's like, they're not even Chinese, but they look like they should be Chinese. So there was a total double standard going on there, which I recognized very early. But from my situation, people were almost always very patient with me and had very low expectations. And when I could speak a little bit, generally got pretty excited about the fact that I even tried. So that's a good thing. But yeah, I took French in high school, and, you know, it's so much easier because there's words that are called cognates that, you know, that are the same, right? That you recognize nothing. And in fact, the first year I studied, your brain keeps trying to make parallels between your language and Chinese, between English and Chinese, and there just aren't any. And you can't read it because the written language is characters, and that's completely unhelpful. And then the tones, forget it. Because this word ma is ma, you know, 5 different words. In fact, probably 40 different words. If you don't grow up listening to that, it's very difficult. I mean, now both my kids, my daughter's fluent in Chinese because she spent a year there in high school. She actually, so she was there for middle school and 1 year of high school. But then when we came back to America the first time, she took a year off of school, high school here between her junior and senior year, and went back to China, lived with a Chinese family, and went to a Chinese high school.
Oh, wow.
So it's an incredible experience. So she's fluent. And my son is, who has lived there total of 5 years of his life. But he was, 8 to 11, and then he took a 5-year gap. So he started over in high school, but now he's studying in college, and now he's getting pretty good at it too. So that young brain helps a lot as well, but I just don't. I gave up a long time ago. And I didn't need it. With all the translations apps, I mean, you can take pictures of the characters now, and it translates, your phone translates everything for you. You can, hit the translation while somebody's talking, and it tells you what they're saying. You don't need it to get along. So I quit. And it was just a lot of time and effort that I could have spent doing something else.
Yeah. How we hear a lot about WeChat here in the United States as this like God app that does everything. And Elon Musk wants to turn Twitter into like WeChat. And what was the experience of using Chinese? What was the experience of using Chinese apps, also like the internet? Because we hear the stereotype that the internet is limited in China. You can't do certain things. So what was that technology piece like for you?
So WeChat is amazing, and it's awesome, and it's great. But the reason it's amazing and awesome and great is because everybody is on it. Everybody in China has a WeChat account. Everybody uses it for everything, which is great. You don't have to say, okay, I want to get in touch with Sally. Okay, she is on Facebook with me, so I have to Facebook message her. But but I want to get in touch with Sam. Okay, I text Sam. Everybody's on a different platform here, right? Everybody's on WeChat, which is great, but it's a monopoly. And it's controlled by the government, and it is completely watched. Like, there are words you cannot say in WeChat. One of the things everybody has, all expats have in China, is a VPN, virtual something network, private network. Yeah. Which you just put that sucker on, you turn your app on or whatever, and tell it you're in LA or whatever, and then you can get on Facebook and all of those things that are blocked. It is not difficult in China at all to do that. It is very easy to get VPNs. Chinese people do it as well, but they are against the law now. So if you talk about it on on WeChat, if you talk about, oh, turn your VPN on because you want to go to this site, then that will get flagged and somebody will look at it. And if it happens enough on your chat will get deleted. So yeah, so the government is watching. So you use things. So for VPN, and we did very precious necklace, or somebody called it your Veep, or there were a whole bunch of different things people called it, but you didn't write VPN on your chats, because the way WeChat works, that no app that I have right now does, is you can make these groups of people. So for instance, like you with your Charlotte Dune, you could have a group of your followers all in this chat, and you would use that to promote yourself and tell people when you had new episodes out or things like that. But at the same time, you could individually talk to each of those people, and those people could have that, but not have it turned on all the time, so that they could look at it whenever they want. It's just a very, very flexible way to market things, to contact groups of people, if you go out for lunch with people, everybody paying, you could split the bill. I mean, very, very easily. Everybody's paying on WeChat anyway, so you can send money back and forth. So it's like, it's your Zelle app and your banking app, and it's, well, not your banking app because it goes through your bank card, but it's everything. Plus you can use it like Facebook too and post pictures. I didn't really do that, but a lot of people do. So it's a cool app, but again, it's monopoly. I generally don't approve of those, especially when they're controlled by the government.
Yeah.
And we couldn't really do that here anyway because of banking laws. I think it would be hard. This, and security is an issue with it. I used it with a Chinese bank card that never had that much money on it, so it was not that big of an issue, but they were getting phone messages through the phone company. They would send text to everybody about frauds and being careful about banking fraud and things like that. So it's an issue.
What was it?
That was
like?
One part of your question. I feel like there was another part of that question I forgot to answer.
Oh no, I think you answered it all. But
okay.
What was it like living under that kind of surveillance state? Like a more overt, because I do think the US is a surveillance state also, but a more overt surveillance state.
I mean, most of the time it didn't really bother me because I wasn't doing anything wrong. There are, a lot of pluses and minuses. Like I understand privacy and I understand people's problems with face recognition. But at the same time, sometimes it's really helpful. Like you could use it as a key to get into my apartment, you just show my face to the screen. And somebody did something wrong, like stole something. Nobody stole anything. There was no crime. There was no violent crime because they got caught because there were cameras everywhere. You certainly wouldn't do it against a white person because that would make you a bigger target. So, I mean, we just, like, my 12-year-old daughter would walk around at 1 a.m. No, I didn't let my 12-year-old daughter walk around at 1 a.m., but she could have. She did when she was older, when she came to visit us, and I didn't worry at all because A, the punishments are harsh and scary, and B, you're gonna get caught. So people don't do stuff. So there is that. But I do believe in privacy. I never felt personally repressed by it. I did with some of the COVID restrictions when they came down. Everybody did. That's why there were actually protests in China there at the end, which is a huge deal. There weren't very many, and it was, we're talking hundreds of people, not even thousands probably, but still, just the fact that there were those was huge. That era felt repressive. When you guys were all over COVID and had gotten through it, and the world was recovering, and we were still, couldn't leave really. And at that point, we couldn't leave Beijing, because just getting back into Beijing was a quarantine situation. That started to feel repressive. And I think that's part of the reason when you ask me, would I go back to China? I say I don't want to. I think I kind of lost, I don't know. I had a love for it. And I still do a little bit, but I lost some feeling. I don't exactly know the right word. I don't trust them anymore, I guess. And part of it was when COVID did come, like we were testing every day, and that was not uncommon. Every 3 days, whatever, to go get tested, and it was so easy. You walk downstairs, you got in a line with maybe 10 people in it. They swabbed your throat real quick, did a QR code, swabbed your throat real quick, and you were done. So it was like literally like 5 to 10 minutes of my time. It was not that big of a deal, and I don't care what they're doing with my swabs, my DNA, whatever. They had that to begin with. You have to give them that when you come live there. They take a blood sample. But that didn't bother me. But when people started to get COVID, those tests weren't coming back. The results weren't coming back. Like my husband and I both had COVID, and we both got tested probably when we had COVID, and we never got a positive test back. And I never heard about anybody who did. So it was like at that point there was no honesty. And when it started to come down, when they kind of decided, okay, we're going to rip the Band-Aid off and we're just going to let it come. They didn't tell us. And I don't know what it was. Like, I felt like I'd been on this journey with COVID in China, and this really interesting experience. And I was like, I couldn't read the last chapter because I didn't really know what was going on. I mean, but I finally did figure it out as all my friends started getting COVID, and they weren't, in the past, if somebody had gotten COVID, you were hauled off to a hotel or a quarantine hospital, really. And that wasn't happening anymore. They were letting it go, but it just didn't, we never really nobody ever said anything about it. It just sort of happened, and you had to figure out what was going on your own. And for some reason that pissed me off.
Yeah, I would imagine.
I think it's my background as a biologist, and knowing that this was going to happen at some point. And then when it did start happening, like not getting the data, not getting the details, not knowing, just frustrated the heck out of me. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. We were on our way home anyway. We were on a 4-year package, and it was done anyway. So that also might have something to do with it. And when you're leaving a place, you have a tendency to focus more on the negatives than on the positives. So that was definitely part of it as well. But man, I still, I don't know, it was frustrating.
I can imagine. What was it? Did you guys also have a period of like fear? Because in the States, we had so much fear for a while. Like people were genuinely extremely frightened, and everybody was holding like a lot of fear in our bodies. We just didn't know what was going to happen or how contagious it was. And
I don't think we had that. I think Chinese people did. When it first happened, when it was going on in Wuhan, I was naive at that point and kind of an idiot. Now, Chinese people had been through, I guess it was, what was it, the bird flu? There was SARS years before. And I mean, like we had a neighbor who, I don't think she left her house for a couple months in the very beginning. And which was entirely voluntary. I mean, a lot of people didn't. We would go on buses and be the only people on these buses. And I mean, I told you these buses could be so packed that people are like, pushing themselves in, and there was nobody on the buses. And this was in the beginning. But I was naive at that point, and I thought everybody was overreacting, and this was stupid. This was before it had hit the US. And later on, when we did sort of figure it out, China had already isolated it and become zero COVID. And so then we didn't really have to fear that much. I mean, we did a little bit. We were more fearing about somebody getting through, and then us not necessarily getting COVID from that person, because we're talking like, I mean, in a couple of years there, China had like 500 cases. After the initial, or not China, Beijing had like 500 cases. There's just over years of 20 million people. The idea of catching it was like not really even going to happen. But like, I had a friend who got locked down in her apartment once for 2 weeks, just her personally, because she went to a grocery store where a delivery driver who had COVID he came after her even, which is ridiculous, came like an hour after her. So this is how strict they were. Like they track, because they have, all of this lack of privacy. anybody who had COVID, they tracked everything they did for like a week before. Everybody that came into contact them was going to get quarantined. Now, she was just at home, but like close contacts, they ended up in hospitals. Even secondary close contacts, secondary like close contacts of close contacts would end up in hospitals. That I was afraid of. But I wasn't actually afraid of getting COVID. So it was a little bit different. But no, in general, I think you guys had it much, much worse than I did. I can just tell, having been back here and listening to people talk about how isolated they felt, and how, I mean, like you said, like people were holding it in their bodies, like how it has changed, especially younger people, how they deal. And I mean, with life, with people, with interacting. I think that was much worse for you guys than it was in China. The repression of the virus was such that, I mean, yes, okay, we felt like we were a little confined, but you guys, it was the fear of actually getting it, and getting long COVID or dying or things like, I think was much, much worse for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, like thinking back on it, it was such a crazy and unnecessarily fearful time in America. So I'm glad that you guys didn't have to go through that there. I think Americans will be surprised to hear that, because we do have that impression of like, oh, everybody's wearing like hazmat suits and getting nose swabs every 2 hours or something crazy.
The nose swabs were not fun, but honestly, I had the nose swabs done only when I traveled out of country. That's the only time they did the nose swabs. Every other time it was throat swabs, because you don't have to train somebody as much to do the throat swabs. And they had literally tens of thousands of people doing this testing every day. So they couldn't be doing nose swabs.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think Americans would allow a city to get locked down like that, like to be able to leave and exit the city. So that must have been an interesting experience to deal with also, because what were there, just like roadblocks on the way out?
Well, you could leave. I should replace it. We could absolutely leave. It's just, if we wanted to come back, we might not even be able to come back. So there was a period of time, and they were especially Beijing, and especially around the time of the Winter Olympics, because the last thing they wanted was for Beijing to have any COVID during the Winter Olympics. So they made it so hard to come back that you just didn't leave. Does that make sense? So it's like, even if you went on vacation, like at one point I remember, okay, well, you can go on vacation if you want, but if there are any cases in the city in which you go, you can't come back until you've been somewhere for 2 weeks where there are no cases. So it's like, okay, well, you can take that trip if you want to, but you might not even be able to get back. I mean, it was such that like you had to be careful. So Beijing is a province. It's a city, but it's also a province of China. And like you had to be careful when you were going out hiking that your cell phone didn't ping like in the neighboring province, in a cell phone tower in the neighboring province, because it would pop up and you needed your QR code to get in anywhere you wanted to go. We had this, like, you had to scan and show a QR code with your health kit, which was also, of course, through WeChat. So everywhere you went, every grocery store, every restaurant, any museums, anything like that would have a QR code that you scanned, and then you'd show somebody that you were healthy. But if you pinged outside in like Hubei, that would come up red.
Oh no.
Yeah. And I mean, it never happened to me. It never happened to anybody I knew. Well, not really. But you didn't take the risk. So you just stayed in Beijing. And Beijing has a lot of things to do, a lot of amazing food, so many opportunities for fun stuff to do that it wasn't really much of a hardship. But
yeah, what are the favorite like leisure activities there? Because when you said hiking, I wouldn't have even imagined like being close enough to hiking in like a city of that many people. Like what?
Oh yeah. So Beijing is the city, and it's also the environs around, like the Great Wall. I mean, you go hike the Great Wall. I mean, the parts that you see you see the sort of the restored parts, but there's all these unrestored parts that you can go hike in and camp in overnight, and all kinds of fun stuff to do up there. All lots of streams and mountain areas, and it's Beijing is a bit of a bowl, which is why pollution can be an issue, because when bad air comes, it kind of actually gets stuck in the bowl. But the bowl is made by these mountains on, like, probably 2/3 of it is surrounded by mountains. They're not high mountains or anything like that, but they're fun to hike. And the Great Wall is parts of it are up in those mountains, and that's always fun. But I mean, anything that you can think of to do, almost, you can do in Beijing. You want to ride a horse, you want to play tennis, you want to ultimate frisbee is becoming huge there now. My son was an ultimate frisbee player. Anything you want, you can pretty much do / get. I used to ask my Chinese friends, is there anything you want me to bring back from the United States? Like, no, we can get it all ourselves, thanks. And that is pretty much true. There's a Starbucks on every corner. It's far more Western than people think it is. We don't have any oceans and not a lot of pools, and a lot of the pools are indoors, which is kind of a bummer. So I would fault it for that, but otherwise there's an awful lot to do. And then temples and museums and all kinds of fun cultural stuff if you're into that kind of thing, which I totally am.
Yeah, I'm surprised there's no outdoor pools, because doesn't it get pretty hot there?
Yeah, it does. I mean, Chinese people are not big swimmers. So that's part of it. I think they will get to be more of them. But yeah, and they're also a little bit afraid of the sun. White skin is very prized there. So like, I've literally been to the beach and seen women completely covered, including like a mask where just their eyes and nose and mouth show. It's like a bathing suit mask, but they're completely covered because they don't want their skin to darken. So that's part of that. They prefer to swim inside when they do swim, and they tend to swim for exercise, not so much for leisure. It's just not culturally as prominent of a fun, hang out by the pool with your cocktail type place type thing as it is here.
What are the coolest things that are there that we don't have here, besides birds, besides people walking their birds?
Besides people walking their birds. Oh, wow. That's a tough one. I mean, the Asian food is amazing. Like, not just Chinese food. I mean, and Chinese food there is very different than Chinese food here. What we get here, I've decided I'm calling the food of the Chinese diaspora. It's just different, Americanized Chinese food. And I get where it came from, and I like it too, but Chinese food in China is different and better. But even like the Vietnamese food and the sushi and all kinds of things like that, that's pretty amazing. I mean, I just love walking around there. So, and part of this is just big city life. Like, you walk outside and there's always people, and Chinese people don't really, I don't know if I can say they don't care as much about, I shouldn't generalize about Chinese people, but they're a little bit more free with what they wear, with what they do. I mean, and life is just a little bit more whimsical there. Like, the other day I was walking out of my complex, and there was a Meituan driver, a delivery driver, who's delivering food to somebody in front of me, and he had his helmet on because they're all on scooters. Everybody's on a scooter. A moped, like a Vespa type scooter. And I looked at his helmet, and it was a helmet that was made to look like a rice pot, like a rice cooker. Like, it had dials and it had the little spatula stuck on it, just like a Chinese rice cooker. I mean, and they just, everything, there's these funny little things about everything that I don't know, and it's hard to describe. People just don't care as much. So they about what people think of them, I think. They'll wear what they want to wear, and a little bit do what they want to do. The spitting I could do without. And I kind of, they walk their birds, and they, dance. They do the old ladies do their dances in the parks, and there seems to be sort of a freedom of expression somewhat. I mean, which is funny because lots of ways you can't express yourself at all in China. So it's hard to describe. But yeah, I walking the streets was always just fun. I mean, it's just every time you go out, it was an adventure. It's like, what am I going to see today? And maybe that's just because it was a new and different culture for me. But even after having lived there 6 years, I still felt like that. Every time I got on my bike, it's like, ooh, what am I going to see today? Is there going to be a moped laden with styrofoam, mountain of styrofoam because it's a recycling guy, or the knife guy. So they have the guy that goes around. He's always this old guy on this ancient bicycle, who comes around and he has metal plates, and they're the sharpening plates that he clangs together to announce that he's there. And you go down and he sharpens your knives. It was just interesting, different from America. But yeah, there's probably a lot of other things I could talk about that I liked, that we don't have here, but there's a lot of things we have here that I like. Taobao also is quite nice. Everything's cheap. I mean, it's also cheap quality, but it's also cheap.
I was going to ask about the cost of living, like in general, like, how much is a nice apartment in Beijing? Like, how much does it cost to live there? Could Americans even go live there? You have to have like a work permit kind of situation.
Yeah, you right now, and I think they've reinstated the tourist visa right now, but you get 90 days on a tourist visa. No, to just go live there, you have to have an employer who's sponsored your work permit, or be related to somebody who does. But yeah, it's Beijing is expensive to live in, like the apartment part is expensive. We could never have done that without my husband's company paying for the apartment. Our apartment was about $5,000 a month. But it wasn't huge. But it had a great view. It was in a good place with a really great view. And we wouldn't do that here. But you can live cheaper if you live out of town more. And definitely teachers do it. There's a lot of Westerners who go and teach in America, and they do sometimes get their housing paid for. But even then they probably could do that. But the apartments are expensive. Starbucks coffee is expensive. Anything Western is expensive. But if you just want to make yourself some noodles, or like I could go down and get an awesome meal for like $2, no problem, easy. Just behind my house, like we had this fancy apartment complex, which really wasn't that fancy. It's getting old, but comparatively it is. But right behind it, we still had some old kind of hutong areas, and I mean, I could get a donkey meat sandwich for like $1.50. You could get some baozi, some buns for pennies. So that kind of thing. Because I had a fresh noodle guy who was making fresh noodles all the time, and I could get like this giant pound of fresh noodles for $1. That kind of thing always blew me away how cheap it was. So,
wow. What does a donkey meat sandwich taste like?
Corned beef. Almost exactly.
I've always wondered, why do they call the wet markets the wet markets?
Because everything is wet, because they're always washing it down with hoses, and then this stuff is leaking because they're so messy. And there aren't nearly, like when we were there the first time, we had a wet market right behind our house, and it was this traditional old wet market where I didn't buy chicken there in the summer because the chicken might have been sitting on that table for who knows how long. But I never had any health issues or anything buying stuff from there. But those are almost all gone. In fact, everything like that is gone. That is when I said that they cleaned up the bathrooms, they also took out the wet markets. Obviously, they hadn't done that in Wuhan. Although that wet market, I actually did visit the wet market where the virus started. I couldn't go in, just the outside. And it was an indoor market as well. So now all the wet markets in China are inside, and I have much better sanitation requirements. So Beijing has definitely changed that. But the rest of China has a little bit of catching up to do in that regard.
Yeah, I wasn't going to ask you about COVID and wet markets and that kind of stuff, but since you are a biologist and here go my dogs. Speaking of animals.
Oh yeah, my cat's staring at us.
Must be the mailman outside. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Let me just wait for them to simmer down a second. I'll edit this part out. Nobody usually comes here in the middle of the day unless except the mailman. I wasn't going to ask you about this, but since you do seem like you have interest, um, what was going on in China as far as like theories on COVID? Because in the US, we really got inundated with, different sides of the political spectrum telling us where COVID had come from and where they thought, lab leak, engineered, bioweapon, wet market, like attack
Same
on.
thing.
So you guys got the same thing.
We got the same thing. I mean, China will never admit that it started in China. I have one of my good Chinese friends, her parents, who she's from Wuhan, actually. Her parents honestly believe that Americans brought the virus to Wuhan during the military games, which was right before that. And I mean, and these are educated people, they believe this. There's a lot of bad, I get, nobody knows, and China's not going to admit it. So Chinese people are going to think whatever they've heard in their bad sources of media that they're looking at. But no, I didn't really, I mean, I heard everything that you heard. I was pretty much looking at Western media about it anyway. I was very much subscribed to the whole, oh, well, there's a, animal testing facility right near the wet market, but which seems to me, from my biological training, to be the clearest option, but that seems to have been disproved. So I don't know. I wish people would just stop blaming anybody about it. It doesn't matter where it started. Yeah. These things are going to happen, then they're going to start in different places, and it's not that place's fault. It is that place's fault if they don't deal with it in a manner that is acceptable, which Wuhan may or may not have tried to do. Depends on who you talk to. But it is what it is, and we just have to deal with it as a nation, and hopefully as a world. But hopefully we've learned something. I'm curious to see if this happens again in my lifetime, which I hope it doesn't, how the world reacts, how China reacts, how America reacts. I don't know that America will react much differently than it did in the first place, except that people will probably be a lot quicker to put on a mask, because I think people kind of got used to that here. I know nobody liked it, but at least they got used to it. Whereas Chinese people put on their masks pretty fast because they were used to SARS. But yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, there was so much in the beginning, like we didn't know how it was transmitted, that kind of thing. I remember very early on, it was killing people, it was killing men at a much higher rate in China than it was killing women. And people were like, oh, it's the virus has something against men. But the fact of the matter is it's a respiratory disease, and Chinese men almost all smoke and Chinese women don't. So yeah, I mean, that's put them more at risk of dying. And as soon as it moved out of America, people stopped that storyline. But it was interesting. It's been interesting to see the two cultures deal with it, for sure.
Yeah. What is like the cross population of the media like for, like, Americans don't watch Chinese television, but do Chinese people watch a lot of American television, or there's really no exchange?
And by TV, like, they watch Friends. They like Friends.
Oh no.
Yeah. The last time I was there, you could actually go to a coffee shop where it was exactly like the set of Friends, and all the waitresses were named Rachel. It's really funny. That's gone now. But they don't get any news. They don't get any American news, or if they do, they bleep out. Like, it literally will go silent or dark during anything that they've decided is not appropriate for the Chinese public to hear. So yeah, in general, most Chinese people don't see any of that unless they're keyed in enough to have a VPN and be using it to explore other options, which most people aren't.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering more about, like, not the news, but like pop culture, like things like Friends. And like, I recently watched the Three Body Problem series, the Chinese television show. And my partner and I were commenting like, this is the first Chinese television show we've ever seen. I mean, you get a lot of Korean shows now on Netflix. Like the Korean shows are very popular with the younger generation. Like my daughter's 15 and she's constantly watching K dramas and
Great.
but like I don't know. I don't think many Americans have watched a Chinese television show. And I think it would probably really benefit both cultures to have more like pop culture exchange. Maybe not. I don't know. Your face went.
Well, yeah. I don't think they'd watch it.
Yeah.
I think that Chinese television would be cheesy and stupid to most Americans. The three body problem is a little bit different. That has kind of taken off here. But I think a lot of what like I know that Chinese people watch are like soap operas. You know, maybe, I mean, but like set in imperial times with like empresses and stuff. I mean, I'm out of my depth here because I do not watch Chinese television. So I may be completely wrong about this. So Chinese people should tell me I'm wrong. But most of what I've seen on their television, most Americans would find cheesy. Like when they have their New Year's shows and stuff like that. It's like, God. So I think that may be why you don't see it. They do get a lot of like they watch like the big Marvel movies and things like that, but I don't know about TV. Like I don't know.
It's very different tastes, like very different, because I was very impressed with the Three Body series. It was not cheesy at all. I was like, they must have subsidized the production of it because it was a huge production and I don't think they spent very much money on it, or I guess just I was very impressed. Like one scene in the show, I was like, this might be the craziest scene I've ever seen in anything I've ever watched.
Really?
So
wow. I read it. I'm going to have to go back and see it and watch it. That'll be fun. Yeah. I probably shouldn't even speak to Chinese television because I don't really know. I did watch a lovely movie. I forgot the name of it. It would be helpful if I had that. It was a great movie about villagers in China. But it got banned shortly after I watched it.
Yeah.
So, but it was winning international awards. But yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, I got, when I talked about watching that show and even reading the book, like on social media, I did get messages from people being like, oh, you shouldn't even watch that because it's supporting the CCP, and like the CCP has the genocide with the Muslims. So you shouldn't even be watching any of this. But I'm just kind of like, well, if we don't see anything, how do we learn about anything?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've like, do people talk about those issues on a regular basis in Beijing, or is it really like hush hush?
Oh, like the Uyghurs? Yeah. Well, I mean, we'd talk about that, but publicly you wouldn't. You would never talk to a Chinese person about that. You would never say anything or use any of those words on WeChat at all. But I mean, we were all educated people who were all aware of the problem and all aware of what it means for us to be there. And we did have many conversations about this. I wanted to go to Xinjiang because we could have gone and seen it, not seen that part of it. We would have been not able to go to the camps or anything like that, of course. And like journalists had a really rough time trying to go there unless they were on there for a specific project, in which case they would have been minded. But I still wanted to go, and my husband was like, no, you can't go. You're supporting, the oppression of the Uyghurs. And like, dude, we're supporting that by being here in general. And I mean, but no country is perfect. I didn't like living in the US when we were caging children at the border either. But this is my life. So, I speak out against it as much as I can. But the fact of the matter is, when you live in a foreign country, you're there as guests. And, I'm not there to solve their problems, can't solve their problems, don't know the whole story, although I know enough. So yeah, it was not the easiest thing for us to talk about, but we did try to, because we all understood. But yeah, you get over it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's like bigger than you are. And then you meet lovely people on an individual basis, and
Mhm.
you're there bridging those gaps, just being there and having people get to know you as an
Yep.
American and vice versa.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I'd love to travel around China, but you do hear that if you travel around China, as a tourist, you're going to get minded. So I wonder, like, how much is the minding?
I I think that probably happened to me more than I thought it would. I mean, Beijing has a lot of foreigners in it. You can't mind everybody. And my husband works for a Chinese company. I think like my friends who were diplomats, they got minded. That's different. And there were a couple times when we were in groups that we were, sort of set aside, like, what are you doing here? Kind of things. And it led to some awkward situations, especially during COVID, when we weren't supposed to be getting together as groups at all. But yeah, in general, I never felt that. Like, there was one on my very last trip, we went to Macau a couple months ago, and I think there might have been somebody that was following us a little bit there, but he couldn't have kept up with us anyway. I don't know exactly. I mean, Macau is different, right? Because Macau is like Hong Kong, and in that it, was a Portuguese colony, and people are used to more freedoms, and those freedoms are going away. So that's a place where, it's an issue, just like Hong Kong. So, but I personally didn't feel that ever. I'm not going to say it didn't happen to me. There weren't, I mean, but they're not going to spy on my husband because he works for a Chinese company and they can do that at work. It's not, that's not really an issue. And I was never a threat, I guess. I mean, I'm sure there's a file on me somewhere, but
Yeah.
probably pretty thin. But yeah.
Did you ever feel like your group got infiltrated by
No,
like a binder?
no, honestly, there weren't a lot of Chinese people. I have one really good Chinese friend who's married to a French man, and then several other like Chinese background, but Filipino or Malaysian. Like, I think we didn't have all that many Chinese people in our little group of expats. But no, I never felt like, I mean, they would have been bored out of their mind, I think. I mean, I guess the lecture group was the only thing that might have ended up being a little bit dicey, but most of those lectures he had given in public. Like, I was one at a brewery, I remember. So I don't think we were much of a target.
Oh, speaking of breweries, and that's good that didn't have that happen, because that would be intense and awkward also. Speaking of breweries, I put the fact that I was going to interview an American woman who had been an expat in China for many years, and asked if anybody had any questions. And one of the questions was, what is the nightlife like in China?
Okay. Well, I'm 50 years old, so my nightlife ends at about 10 o'clock. So I'll tell you two perspectives. My night, I mean, it's fun. It's as fun as you want it to be. And I'm sure there's a fabulous seedy side to it as well. I have no idea about that. I mean, my daughter used to, when she would come visit us, she went out clubbing until like 4 a.m. And as a white girl, my God, she didn't have to pay for anything. And there's definitely a big club scene. I have no idea about that. Never did it. A couple of my friends did it just to see what it was like. Yeah, not into that. We're more brewery people. My husband is a big fan of beer, so we checked out a lot of the breweries. There was one music club we liked to go to that had expat bands that would play. Like, there was a Red Hot Chili Peppers cover band kind of thing that would go and play, and it was it reminded me of what like a speakeasy would be like. It was this stage and this fairly small room, and then with a balcony above that you would drink and you could watch, and packed at night. And the DJ came on, and would have been a complete fire hazard had there been a fire, because of the way you had to sort of snake your way into the building. And I'm not sure any other way to get out than that way. But that was fun nightlife there. But again, that's not really my scene.
I was like, I have to ask. I'm sure that the nightclubs are popping.
It's a city of 22 million people. You get pretty much everything. I mean, you could find, I know there were gay clubs, even though that's not really acceptable in China. But there's a whole scene around that too. And, but not that, I don't know. I've never been.
What's the racism situation like there?
It's different. Like, it's very different than the racism here. In my opinion. I mean, like, if you're a Black person, people are just really interested in you. Like, I have seen like Black people just get touched by people. Like, there's not a lot of boundaries, right? Touch their hair, taking pictures of them, because I mean, it's just unusual, right? And I know that, and there was an incident, but that was actually with expats. It's hard for me to tell because I don't speak the language really. I know they have a lot of prejudices. I mean, I've heard Chinese people tell me that people from another province are all liars. And I mean, they're still Chinese. So there's a lot of that. But I didn't see a lot of overt racism there because, 99% of people look the same. Pretty much Chinese. So, I mean, I forgot what the Han Chinese population is there. It's everybody's, the minorities are very minor. So I didn't see that very often, but I know it exists.
Yeah, I was just curious because, some places like they tell you just don't even go if you're Black because people will treat you badly. I've heard that about Jakarta, for example.
Oh, really? Oh, I don't think Black people are not going to get treated badly. They're going to get stared at and they're going to have their picture taken and people are going to be really curious and they may approach them. I mean, even when my young son was little, blonde kid, my daughter once was going to start charging for pictures with her little brother because one person would ask and then people would just line up. I mean, not in Beijing. Beijing is a little bit more cosmopolitan than that, but whenever we traveled, and we traveled all over China, people were just enthralled with little blonde kids. I had a friend who she had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they were both little. And she said she could barely move in Beijing and people were taking the baby out of her hands, and that made her uncomfortable. So it's more that level of curiosity. I wouldn't call it racism because you don't get that deep into it yet. But yeah, if people are not comfortable with that, I mean, people stared at me too. Staring is getting better, but I don't mind. I stare back because I find them, fascinating. But I know a lot of people do mind. And if you did, it's not a great place to go, especially if you're going to villages and places where they don't see foreigners a lot. Beijing's not bad. Shanghai's got a ton of foreigners, so that's not bad. But if you're, going into the smaller places, the smaller cities, it's an issue.
I just have 2 more questions because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
No problem.
But what was your favorite place or favorite places that you traveled around in China?
Mm-hmm. That's a hard one. I've been to almost all of the provinces. So I think my favorite trip I did with a girlfriend in like 2014, and we went to Guizhou province, and we went up into the villages, and we stayed in a minority. I think they were the Miao minority village, and it's one of these you see where the silver headdresses and the beautiful embroidered dresses, and these little villages, they're villages of, I don't know, maybe 500 people tops, and very much have suffered from all of their young people going out to the factories, which is this great migration to the factories that happened in China starting a couple decades ago. And these villages are old people and very young people, and they've found that one way to make money is to, basically host people from abroad and into their, make guest villages or guest villas out of their homes, which are all these traditional old homes. Like, you share bathrooms and they're very simple, but they're clean, and they cook you food. And when you get there, they do their welcoming ceremony and they're all dressed up in their finery. And I mean, it's just amazing, these things. And they do shows for you where they sing, and it's all kind of scripted, but at the same time, this is what they really did. And it's a small, like, they'll do it for like 10 of you or something like that. And they're just, I don't know, it was just kind of a beautiful thing to experience. And we went to a couple of those villages and stayed overnight, and they make you food, and you walk around and they'll let you take pictures, and it's like a different world. And the kids were great, and the old people were great, and lots of fun pictures from that trip. So that was one of my favorites. I think there's been so many. There's also some absolutely beautiful scenery. I mean, the mountains, and I mean, they've got everything. It's like America. They've got mountains, and they've got deserts, and they've got oceans, and they've got gorgeous pools, and they have pandas. Pandas are awesome. I love pandas. I got to hold a panda once. That was amazing. Yeah, expensive, but amazing. It's an amazing country. There's also out west in Gansu province, which is near Xinjiang, they have this, it's called Mogao Grottos, and it's these caves that have been dug out of this, I'm going to say sandstone, over like 1,000 years. Like there's 1,000 years of history that they found in these caves full of Buddhas, and they're painted, and you can see progression of time through the different caves, and there's so much history. It's a UNESCO site. It's like one of their top rated sites. That was an amazing trip as well. Just that part of the country was also fantastic. It's an amazing place to see.
Is there one, like, if an American wanted, or someone from any other country wanted to go to Japan, or oh my gosh, go to China as a tourist,
Mm-hmm.
Is there like one tour company that you guys heard a lot about, or like one way to take a trip to China that was, something that everybody was recommending to their friends, or that you've heard of?
No, not that I'm aware of. No. It's been so long since the tour's been able to go to China. Yeah, I don't know. A lot of these really cheap trips, I think, are kind of flash in the pan things. But I mean, you want to see the Great Wall, right? Everybody wants to see the Great Wall. You got to see the Forbidden City. I mean, you got to go to Beijing, and the Xi'an and the Terracotta Warriors. That's a pretty amazing thing to see too. And Shanghai is great. Shanghai is very international, so to me, it doesn't feel as Chinese as the rest. So it's, I guess, good entry level. Chinese
gateway.
A gateway, yeah. I mean, you start with Hong Kong, which is very international, and then Shanghai. But it's a really cool big city. Lots of lights and laser shows on the Bund at night, which is fun. Lots of great food. In Shanghai. There's just, the whole country's got a ton to see. But no, I don't know of one particular tour company to go with.
I was just curious, sometimes you might hear that in certain places. I also wanted to circle back to something you said about when you were talking about the moped driver with the rice cooker helmet. And I think we always, in the West, we hear a lot that China is a collective society. It's a collective culture, not an individual culture. Like Americans are so individualistic and they're so collective, but it seems like within that, I don't know, I guess I wonder what you think about that. And like, it seems like you were saying that there's more of an individual looseness, like people don't care in certain ways. I don't know if that's a reflection of the informal economy, or if it's has to do with like freedom within this collective.
Yeah, I think when you're part of a collective and everybody has to do the same thing, sometimes there's a really intense desire to stand out and be individual, right? You can't necessarily do it in your thinking, but you can do it in other ways. So maybe that's part of it. I also think that, they're influenced by Japan. They love all things Japanese, sort of, except for they have a horrible history with the Japanese. The Japanese have done some horrible things to the Chinese people, but they still seem to be pretty excited about Japanese culture. And all that cuteness and all, like the cosplay and the K-pop and all of that is very, very popular as well. So I think they're kind of riffing off of that sometimes. Not maybe the rice cooker helmet. I'm not sure where that came from. I almost bought one of those because I have a moped here in America now. But I thought maybe the safety of it probably wasn't up to Western standards, so I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, that kawaii culture is like very the anime influence and the mangas. I guess that leads me to almost my final question. I lied. I have more than two, I guess.
Sorry.
That, going back to these like polarized stereotypes that we have, there also seems to be kind of two viewpoints in the States that I hear a lot. One is the future is Asian. China is going to like eventually rule us. They're like so advanced. They're in the future. They have some kind of advantage of being this like top-down system with all this data. And then the other view that I hear is the CCP is like falling apart from the inside because it's so top down, and like China's going to collapse because they don't have enough people and people didn't have enough kids. So I wonder if you had any opinions on those two extremely different viewpoints that people seem to hold.
Yeah, I think the truth is in the middle. And when people say things like this, I try to remind them part of the reason that China is so successful right now is because we have a successful economy and we're buying all their stuff. We are incredibly linked, our two countries. If one goes down, the other one is going to suffer as well. So really, it's not in either's best interest for one to rule over the other. We have got to find a way to live together, and be mutually beneficial to each other. And it shouldn't be that hard, but I know it kind of is. But yeah, I just don't. It's like the Chinese economy doesn't do well when our economy doesn't do well, and it all comes back to money. So we can all just be friends and make things and buy things from each other and not worry about the rest of it. It's a very simplistic view, I know, but I sometimes don't like to listen to either of those doomsayers either way.
Yeah,
I mean, we all have, both nations have their problem, absolutely, but hopefully we can find a way to get together.
Yeah, it's never that black and white, even though people want it to be like that. My last question is, what will you miss the most about living in China?
Oh, I miss my friends the most. I miss all those people from all the different countries and our fun discussions and going out at night and listening to silly music and playing mahjong and just anytime I wanted to do anything, I just get on WeChat and, hey, somebody want to go walk in the park today? Or, who wants to take a bike ride or whatever? I had this vast group of fabulous people that would do things with me. And I don't have that here. So that is what I miss. It's not uniquely China. It's more about the expat situation there. Though I know it's not like that in all places that people go for the expat experience, but it definitely was a tight community in China. Lots of great people.
That's amazing that you found that community, because I think a lot of people would shy away from going to Beijing. They would be like, oh, too polluted, too foreign, too big of a language barrier. But it's obviously a fascinating, or too oppressive, but it's obviously a fascinating place to get a chance to live where most people won't ever get that chance. So I really appreciate you sharing like your experience of it.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very rare like chance to have to actually live there for 6 years. 6 years is a long time. That's like you're past the honeymoon.
Right. Yes. But there was a 5-year gap in the middle of it. So maybe that helped it. But yes, definitely felt like I was past the honeymoon, especially there at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I could keep asking you so many questions. I'm like, what changed the most in the 5 years?
The thing that changed the most in the 5 years was the amount of money people had. So cars were better. More people had dogs. People kept better care of things like the bathrooms. You could definitely tell that in those 5 years, the economy had improved and more was being spent, not saved. It was that was that. And the fact that we went from, this is a small thing, when we were there the first time, everything was cash. everything we bought was cash. And it was that way for everybody. No credit cards, nothing. When we came back, nobody used cash. So in that period of 5 years, everybody went straight to their phones to WeChat Pay or Alipay, one of the two, which I found to be much more convenient once you got it working. But
yeah, that's one of those like leapfrog things where they can like skip the middle, but we're still in the middle here in America.
Yeah. And again, that's partly security. So we kind of want to be in the middle a little bit. It's okay.
Love it.
All right. Thank you. This has been really fun. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate you talking. Maybe we'll talk again in the future sometime. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Well, folks, that was Melanie Duhon talking about life in China through American eyes. And I'm Charlotte Dune. Thanks for being here. You can find more about me at charlottedune.com and charlottedune.substack.com. And check out my books on Amazon. I'm the author of the Psychedelic Love series, Cactus Friends and Mushroom Honeymoon. And I have a new book that's going to go on pre-sale in July of 2023 called Acid Christmas. So it'll be Christmas in July, and then it'll come out before Christmas in 2023. And then I will also be working on a third book in this series. So thank you so much for being here. Please come on over to Charlotte Dune's Lagoon and subscribe so you don't miss any more of these podcast episodes or any of the writing I do. Bye-bye.